Let me tell you about the day I walked into my skip level's office to ask for a raise and walked out knowing I was about to blow up my entire department. Not because I lost it, not because I went in there with a plan. I went in there with a salary number and a list of accomplishments I'd typed up in Google Docs at 11 o'clock the night before. The way you do when you're trying to present yourself professionally and also have no idea you're about to find out that everything you thought was true about your job is completely wrong. I walked out knowing I needed to build a trap, and I knew exactly who was going to fall into it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name's Jordan, 29 years old, marketing analyst at a fintech company called a fintech company in Austin, Texas. We do commercial security systems for private businesses, alarm infrastructure, access control, monitoring contracts for office parks, medical facilities, retail chains. Not the sexiest product to market, but B2B security is serious money, and the work is genuinely interesting if you're into data-driven campaign strategy, which I am, or was. I don't know, I still am. It's complicated. I'd been at the company for about 2.5 years when everything went sideways. Started as a junior analyst, got bumped to mid-level after 8 months, settled into what I thought was a solid groove. 6 people on our marketing team plus our manager. Good group. Normal office energy. The kind of team where you actually liked most of the people and the work, felt real, and you went home most nights thinking, okay, that was a decent day. Our manager's name was Claudia Marsh. 39, senior director of marketing, 4 years at the company before I got there. And I want to be careful about how I describe Claudia because she's genuinely hard to explain without sounding like you're being dramatic. Claudia was charming. Actually charming. She remembered everyone's birthdays without a calendar reminder, or at least she made it seem that way. She asked about your weekend on Monday morning and tracked the details. If you'd mentioned you were taking your dog to the vet on Friday, she'd ask how it went on Monday and look like she actually cared about the answer. She brought pastries from a bakery on South Congress every time the team hit a milestone. Good pastries too. Not the sad grocery store box kind. She never raised her voice. In 2.5 years, I never heard Claudia Marsh snap at anyone or send a passive-aggressive email or make someone feel bad in a way they could put their finger on. She was warm and professional, and she described herself constantly as a servant leader, which is a phrase I've decided I will never use unironically for the rest of my life. She also talked about her goals constantly, like a lot. Her 5-year plan was to be CMO of a Series B company, which she mentioned to every new hire, every executive she met, every vendor call, that ran long enough to get personal. She was building her personal brand around authentic leadership. She said authentic leadership so often I started an unofficial count. My record was 4 times in a single all hands. I texted my coworker Priya about it from across the room, and she sent back 3 crying, laughing emojis, and I had to pretend I was coughing. Here's the thing about Claudia that took me an embarrassingly long time to understand. She was not lazy. She was strategic. There's a difference. A lazy person doesn't do the work. Claudia did do work. She did the work of managing up, of positioning herself, of being exactly what the right people needed to see at exactly the right moment. That's actually a skill. A gross one, but a skill. What she wasn't doing was any of the actual marketing strategy. That was us. That was me. Here's what a normal week looked like. Claudia would find me on a Monday or Tuesday, usually when the office was still quiet, and she'd lean against my cubicle wall with her coffee and say something like, "Jordan, I've been noodling on something." And I'd look up from whatever I was working on, and she'd lay out this big picture strategic question, vague enough to need development, specific enough to sound like she'd been thinking about it. What do you think about our mid-market approach? Are we really differentiating enough in the healthcare vertical? How do we get ahead of Q3 before Q3 gets away from us? And we'd talk. 30 minutes, sometimes more. And I'd sketch out a framework, and she'd nod along and say, yes, exactly, that's what I was thinking, and ask smart questions that made the framework better. And say, this is great, Jordan, can you build this out? Full brief, projected metrics, timeline. I want to bring something solid to leadership by Thursday, and I'd build it out every time. I want to be honest about something. For a long time, I thought this was just how it worked. Manager brings the vision, analyst does the execution, manager presents to leadership. That's a real thing. That happens at normal companies. So I didn't flag it as wrong for way longer than I probably should have. I thought I was just doing my job and that at some point the output would speak for itself. And I'd get credit for it eventually. Because that's how things work if you just keep your head down and do good work. That's the thing they tell you. Head down, good work, it'll come. I was so naive, it's almost funny now, almost. The first time I remember feeling something was off was about 1.5 years in. Not a big thing, just a weird moment. We had a team stand-up on a Wednesday morning, and my coworker Dev mentioned the acquisition campaign framework offhand. Something like, Yeah, I saw that in the leadership deck. Looks like they're moving forward with the channel split Jordan was sketching out. And I said, wait, what leadership deck? And Dev said, the one Claudia presented last Tuesday. And I said I didn't know she was presenting that yet. And Dev kind of shrugged and said, yeah, I think it went well. And I sat there for a second and felt something small and uncomfortable, and then told myself it was fine. She was presenting to leadership. That was her job. That's what senior directors did. And I went back to my screen. But I kept thinking about it, just the phrase leadership deck. I'd sent Claudia a brief, a working document, something I'd labeled draft clearly in the file name. And somewhere between my desk and the fourth floor, it had become a leadership deck, with presumably her name on it. I told myself I was being petty, that I was making it into something it wasn't. About 3 weeks later, I was in the kitchen getting coffee around 2 in the afternoon, and I ran into Marcus from IT, who said, dude, Claudia's presentation last week was apparently insane. Derek was telling people it was the strongest strategic thinking the marketing team had produced in 2 years. And I said, oh yeah? And Marcus said, yeah, she apparently had this whole competitive analysis framework, really detailed, like actual methodology. I said, yeah, I spent 3 weeks on that. And Marcus kind of tilted his head and said, wait, you built that? And I said, yeah. And he looked at me for a second and said, huh, just huh. And then he grabbed his coffee and went back upstairs. I stood in the kitchen for another 30 seconds. Then I went back to my desk. I kept going back to my desk for another year. That's the part I have the hardest time explaining when I tell this story. Because it's not like I had no information. I had enough information. I just kept finding reasons to explain it away. She's senior, she presents, that's normal. The work still got done. The company was benefiting from the output even if I wasn't getting explicit credit. Maybe I was misreading the situation. Maybe I was just insecure. Part of me wondered, honestly, if this was just how corporate life worked, and everyone else had figured it out years ago, and I was the only one who hadn't gotten the memo. Like maybe credit was just a thing that floated up to whoever had the seniority to catch it, and that was the deal, and you either accepted it or you didn't. Looking back, I want to go find that version of me and shake him. Here's what was actually happening during that year and a half, which I pieced together after everything blew up. Claudia was presenting my work to the senior leadership team every Tuesday morning in their director and above sync, which I was never invited to because I was not a director and above. She was framing it as her strategic vision, with team execution support. She was tracking every KPI improvement, every campaign that performed, every brief that got approved, and logging it against her personal performance record. Her performance reviews, I later found out, were exceptional. She'd been flagged as high potential. She had one-on-ones with the VP of Revenue and the CRO on a regular basis. People liked her, people trusted her. She had built herself an entire parallel reputation in a layer of the company I couldn't see. And her ammunition was my work. Okay, now we're getting to the part that actually matters. 2 years and 4 months in, my salary still hadn't moved since my initial bump at 8 months. I'd brought it up to Claudia twice in one-on-ones, once around the year mark and once around 18 months. And both times, she'd been completely warm about it. She'd said she was advocating for me at the leadership level. She'd said she wanted to make sure the timing was right for maximum impact. She'd said she knew my contributions were significant and she wanted that reflected appropriately. Advocating. Maximum impact. Appropriately reflected. I know corporate doublespeak when I hear it now. At the time, it sounded reasonable. At 2 years and 4 months, I decided to go above her. Not to complain. I want to be clear about that. I know how it looks. I just wanted to have a direct conversation with someone who could make an actual decision. I requested a meeting with Derek Paulson, VP of Revenue, Claudia's direct boss, framed as a career development conversation, which was true. I did want to talk about my career. I also wanted to know if anyone upstairs actually knew my name. Derek had a standing desk he never stood at, and set alignment the way some people say. We'd exchanged maybe 40 words total in 2 years, all of them at company all hands, where he'd shaken my hand and said, "Great to have you on the team." He was perfectly pleasant when I sat down. He was also operating on an entirely different version of reality than I was. We talked for a few minutes about general stuff, and then I brought up compensation, and he nodded in the specific way that means I'm about to say something I think sounds better than it does. He said, "Look, Jordan, we think you're solid. We really do. But the strategic thinking that's been coming out of your team, that's really Claudia. She's the one who's been driving the big ideas to leadership. Your team handles solid execution work, which matters, but in terms of where the senior investment is going right now, and actually, just between us, we're in conversations about moving Claudia into a VP role in the next quarter or two based on her track record. He kept talking. I stopped hearing him. VP role, her track record. I smiled and nodded and said the right things and thanked him for his time and shook his hand and walked to the elevator and pressed a button for the parking garage and sat in my car. 22 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my phone tick from 3:07 to 3:29 and didn't move. I wasn't panicking. That surprised me. I thought I'd be angrier than I was, more frantic. Instead, I just felt this very cold, very settled thing drop into place in my chest. Like something I'd been half knowing for a year and a half had just gotten completely confirmed, and my brain had already moved past the feeling part into the what do we do about this part. What we do about this is prove it. That's what I thought. Sitting in that parking garage under the fluorescent lights with my hands in my lap, not to HR. Not as a complaint that could be dismissed as sour grapes from a junior analyst who didn't get his raise. Something visible. Something concrete. Something that would make itself undeniable without me having to say a single accusatory word. I drove home and I didn't tell anyone what I was planning. I didn't tell Dev or Priya or Marcus. I went to my apartment and I made dinner and I sat on my couch and I started thinking. It took me about a week to figure out exactly how to do it. Claudia's pattern was consistent. She'd come to me with a question. I'd build something real out of it. She'd take it upstairs. The vulnerability in that pattern was simple. She could only present work she didn't fully understand if nobody in the room knew enough to ask hard questions. And leadership had been trusting her framing without interrogating the underlying material because why would they? She was the senior director. She was the expert in the room. So I needed to create a moment where the material interrogated itself. The opportunity came about 10 days after my meeting with Derek. Claudia stopped by my desk with that specific energy she had. The engaged, urgent, big-picture energy, and said she'd been thinking about a new vertical they wanted to push. Healthcare facility management companies. Mid-sized operations running multiple medical office buildings. Real opportunity. Would I be able to put something together? I said absolutely. I went home that night and I stared at my ceiling for a while. Here's the honest version of what the next 2 weeks looked like, because I've told this story before and I always make it sound more confident than it was. The truth is, I spent the first 3 days just thinking about whether to do it at all. Because if I built a trap and Claudia fell into it and it blew up and then somehow traced back to me doing something intentional, that was my career. Not just this job, potentially my career in this city, in this industry. Austin's not that big. People talk. I almost talked myself out of it twice. The thing that kept me going was the memory of sitting in Derek's office while he told me Claudia was getting a VP promotion. Off my work. Off 2.5 years of late nights and early mornings and briefs I'd poured myself into. That image had a way of cutting through the doubt pretty efficiently. I built the healthcare brief. The real version first. All of it. Market sizing, competitor breakdown, pricing analysis, a full go-to-market framework with channel recommendations and a 12-month performance model. Genuinely one of the best things I'd done at that company. I needed it to be good. Obviously good. The kind of thing that invited scrutiny because it deserved it. And then I went to work on the trap. I spent 3 evenings reading actual industry reports, white papers from security infrastructure firms, KPI documentation from comparable B2B verticals. I needed to understand the real naming conventions well enough to build something that sounded exactly like them. The goal was a metric that would pass a quick read but fall apart under a direct question. I landed on the Security Infrastructure Penetration Index, SIPI. I road tested the acronym, said it out loud a few times to see if it sounded real. It did. It sounded like the kind of thing you'd see in a Gartner report. I built a definition for it that used real technical language, real variables from the actual analysis, assembled in a way that was just slightly off, in a way that an actual expert would notice immediately. Then I invented a source, a fictional research firm with a real-sounding name, something bland and credible, the kind of name you'd never actually Google, but wouldn't think twice about in a footnote. I formatted the citation exactly like a real industry report citation. MLA, proper year, everything. I stared at that fake metric for a long time before I saved the file, because once I saved it, that was it. No walking it back. If this worked, something significant was going to happen. If it didn't work, or if it worked wrong, I was done. Not maybe done. Done. I saved the file. I sent the brief to Claudia on a Thursday morning with a note saying I thought the appendix methodology was particularly strong and she should feel free to walk through it in detail if leadership had questions. She replied within 20 minutes. Amazing work, Jordan. Really comprehensive. Exactly what I was looking for. She'd be presenting to the senior team the following Tuesday. I said, great. Looking forward to hearing how it goes. I went home that Thursday night and I did not sleep well. Friday was normal, Saturday was normal. Sunday I cleaned my apartment and watched football and tried not to think about it and mostly failed. Monday, I went into the office and did regular work and said good morning to Claudia. When I saw her in the kitchen and she said good morning back and asked if I had fun over the weekend and I said, yeah, it was good. And she said same. And we both got our coffee and went back to our desks. Tuesday morning she came in looking confident. That's the word. Confident the way she always looked before a presentation, but more so. She'd worn a blazer, she had her laptop bag over her shoulder, and she was carrying her big Yeti, and she stopped at my desk on her way to the elevator and said, today could be a really big moment for us, and she smiled. Us. I said good luck. Hope it goes well. She said thanks, I think it will. I watched her get on the elevator and I turned back to my screen and I opened a spreadsheet and stared at it without seeing it for about 5 minutes. The leadership sync was 9:45 to 11. I know because it was on the shared calendar and I'd looked at it approximately 40 times in the previous week. I watched the clock hit 9:45 and I started working. Actually working, not fake working. I had a lead generation analysis due end of week and I needed to make progress on it, and focusing on something real was the only thing that was going to get me through the next hour. At 10:09 I heard the elevator on the 4th floor open and close. Someone walking fast. I don't know why I noticed that. I just did. At 10:23, my Slack lit up. Marcus. It just said, yo, something's happening up there. Harlow is in the room. Sandra Harlow was our chief revenue officer. She was not a person who showed up to Tuesday morning marketing syncs. I typed back, what do you mean something's happening? He said, it just feels tense. People keep walking past the conference room and looking in. I put my phone face down on my desk. At 11:18, the elevator opened on our floor. I watched Claudia walk past the row of desks without stopping. No hey everyone, it went great. No eye contact. She went straight to her office and she closed the door. She never closed her door. I went to the kitchen and got more coffee I didn't need and stood there for a while. The next 2 days were strange. Claudia was in her office most of the time. She came out for a team stand-up on Wednesday and was completely normal, warm, professional, asked everyone about their projects, but something was slightly different in the energy. Like a TV that's on but nobody's watching it. Thursday afternoon, I got a calendar invite. Video call, Friday morning, 11 a.m. Attendees: Sandra Harlow, Derek Paulson, VP of Product. Subject line: Marketing Strategy Discussion. Jordan, please join. I read it 3 times. Friday morning, I sat at my desk at 10:55 with my notes pulled up, the full brief open in one window, and my heart doing something I preferred not to examine too closely. I joined the call at 11 on the dot. Sandra Harlow was direct from the first sentence. She said they'd reviewed the healthcare vertical brief and had some questions about the methodology. She wanted to walk through it with me directly. I said, of course. We went through it section by section. She asked sharp questions and I answered them. I knew every number, every assumption, every source, because I'd built all of it. When we got to the appendix, she paused and said, tell me about the Security Infrastructure Penetration Index. I said it was a proprietary internal framework I'd developed specifically for this analysis. I explained that existing industry metrics didn't adequately capture the dynamics of mid-market healthcare security adoption, so I constructed this one from scratch. I walked through exactly how it was built, what variables it used, why I'd flagged it in the appendix rather than the body. Sandra said, and Claudia was not able to explain this metric when we asked her. I said I wasn't sure why that would be. I'd submitted the complete brief with full documentation. There was a pause on the call. Derek said, Jordan, how long have you been building the briefs that Claudia presents to leadership? I said, pretty much since I started here. Another pause. Longer. Sandra said, we're going to need to have a more detailed conversation about this. I said I was available whenever worked for them. I hung up and leaned back in my chair and exhaled for what felt like the first time in 2 weeks. Priya walked by and glanced at me and said, you okay? You look weird. I said, I'm fine, just tired. She looked at me for another second and went back to her desk. What came next was HR, documentation requests, a formal review. I gave them everything. Every brief, every email, every Slack thread showing Claudia tasking me with work and me delivering it. 2.5 years of files I'd kept organized because that's just how I am. I keep everything. Folders by quarter. Everything labeled. It turned out being annoyingly thorough was its own kind of preparation for a situation I hadn't known I was preparing for. There was one moment I keep coming back to. About a week into the HR process, I was in the kitchen getting lunch from the fridge, and Claudia came in. Just the two of us. She went to the coffee machine, and I was putting my food in the microwave, and neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then she said, "Hey, Jordan." I said, "Hey." She said, "Hope you're doing okay through all this." I said, "I'm fine, thanks." She said, "I've always valued your contributions to the team. You know that, right?" The microwave beeped. I took my food out and said, "Appreciate that, Claudia." And I walked back to my desk. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing else to say. I wasn't angry in that moment, which surprised me. I was just done. Done with the smile and the pastries and the authentic leadership and the us. Just completely finally done. The resolution took about 3 weeks. Claudia was moved to a project coordinator role in operations. Not fired, no dramatic exit, no walk of shame through the open floor plan. Just quietly repositioned in the way that companies reposition people when they can't fire them but also can't leave things the way they are. She sent an all-team email saying she was excited about a new opportunity to contribute in a different capacity and was grateful for everything the marketing team had accomplished together. I read it twice. Then I deleted it. I got a salary adjustment and a one-time performance bonus. I also got a conversation with Derek and Sandra where they told me they were restructuring the team's reporting lines and wanted to talk about what a senior role might look like. I said I was open to that conversation. Marcus stopped by my desk that afternoon and said, "Dude, just dude." And I said, "Yeah." And he said that fake metric thing is genuinely one of the coldest things I've ever heard. And I said, "I know." He nodded slowly, very seriously, and said, "Respect." Then he went back to IT. The team dynamic after was different. Better. Genuinely better. When you remove the layer of someone managing up at the expense of the people under her, the actual work gets to breathe. Turned out we had a strong team that had been running at about 60% capacity because so much energy was going into feeding a machine that ran on other people's output. I've been at the company about a year since all of this. Still in Austin. Still in marketing. The job is different now in ways that are hard to quantify except to say that I go home most days without that specific low-grade tension I'd been carrying for over a year without fully naming it. I think about Claudia sometimes, not with a lot of anger. More with this tired recognition of a type. She wasn't stupid. She made a calculated bet that the people doing the work would keep doing the work and never figure out what was happening above their heads. And she was right about that for 2.5 years. That's actually impressive in a completely terrible way. What she didn't account for was a guy who kept his files in order, built her a metric she couldn't explain, and waited patiently for someone important to ask about it. My dad had a thing he used to say when I was growing up. If you're going to do something, do it all the way or don't do it at all. He meant it about fixing cars and homework and yard work and stuff. But it applies. If you're going to put your name on someone else's work for 2.5 years, you better understand every single page of it. Turns out, that part matters.